we're talking about the ground, but does anyone in the panel have a comment about, even in Lubbock, Texas, if you walk outside, you look at the sky, you see these jets streaking across and pouring what people call chemtrails. And the government says it's to bring rain to where they're putting these lines in the sky. But if we force rain here, are we not taking rain away from somebody else on the other side of the planet? Do you have any comments on
cloud seeding?
Cloud seeding.
Yes.
I don't know. They still do that? They still do it?
Yeah, in some places. So it's really interesting because here in Texas, we see so much of the sky. And people here spend a lot more time looking at the sky than people who live in other places. You notice that?
Mm-hmm.
So when we look up at the sky, we see these white trails crossing the sky. What are those trails? Those are condensation trails, contrails for short. What happens is, as a jet goes through a pocket of humid air, the exhaust from the jet, which is just particles of soot and dust, that's all, not chemicals, it produces nuclei for the water vapor to condense around. Because interestingly, most water vapor, it needs a nucleus to condense around to form a cloud. And so if you have a super clean atmosphere, it's very difficult to get clouds. You need some type of dust in the atmosphere for all those water vapor molecules to kind of glom onto and then form clouds. So as strange as those contrails look, and sometimes they look pretty strange, because we have some crazy winds here that can blow one this way and one that way. As strange as they look, they are literally just water vapor that condensed around the dust and soot coming out of airplane exhaust. But around about in the 1960s, and I actually took a class from an old Swiss professor who pioneered this in Israel back in the 50s. Around about the 1960s in this part of Texas, it got very popular to try something called cloud seeding, which is not dangerous chemicals. It's silver nitrate, that's all it is. But the idea was to have these low-flying small planes that would spew these specific chemicals or specific substances into the air that were really good at attracting water vapor. You know, kind of like what you have in babies' diapers? You have stuff in babies' diapers that's really good at attracting water. Yeah, that. So they would spew this substance out that was really good at having the water particles glom onto it, with the idea that the more clouds you form, the more chance you have of raining. So they did this up and down West Texas, and Richard Peterson, who was the former chair of geoscience, was around when that happened, and he gave a very interesting talk at one of our seminars 2 years ago that you can find on our YouTube channel on this. But what happened was exactly what you said. It turned out that the county that paid for the seeding would often get rain, but the amount of rain they got was, number one, not proportional to the expense of the cloud seeding, because it's quite expensive. And number two, the farmers downwind of them found that their rainfall was actually going down, so there's a ton of lawsuits. And they pretty much canceled the program, and I thought that there was nobody else doing it in West Texas, like you said. But I got to know the guy who manages the Canadian Water Authority, and it turns out that they've been doing it off and on in the Canadian Water Authority, just at the border of Oklahoma and Texas. They've been doing it a little bit still up until last year, because they found that in certain situations with certain weather patterns, it was actually cost effective to get a certain amount of rain. So where does the whole chemtrail thing come in? What's happened is, as people look up in the sky and see all these condensation trails crossing the sky, some of them looking pretty funky, they say to themselves, well, that can't be water vapor, that has to be chemicals. It has to be dangerous chemicals that they're conducting a military experiment with. And so there's this whole idea that the government is trying to mind control everybody, and they're doing so by putting chemicals out of the backs of regular commercial airlines. And that's where the myth has come out of it. And if you're interested in learning more about that, there's a good Wikipedia page on the chemtrail conspiracy theory. And where did that come from? It came from the simple idea that those contrails look pretty strange sometimes, especially up here where we spend a lot of time looking at the sky. And so I know people, and I'm sure you do too, who will absolutely swear that it's part of a secret military experiment, but it isn't.
Yeah, that's the Alex Jones, the radio show. Kind
Yes,
of,
yes, exactly.
InfoWars.
It isn't, but...
Or to Jade Hill.
Right, yes, right. But there's a grain of truth, and the grain of truth is the fact that cloud seeding was done here quite extensively in the 1960s and is still being done up in the Canadian River Basin today, which is really fascinating. So yeah, it's
Well, there were all kinds of, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, all kinds of attempts, some of them, and ideas about what would bring rain.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that rain would follow the plow. If you plow the earth, it would liberate something and would cause rain, or they would even fire cannons into the air.
They did.
To try to...
Well, and the basic idea was you want to put dust and soot up in the atmosphere because the more condensation nuclei you have, the more clouds will form. So they weren't crazy,
Right.
but it just wasn't nearly as effective as they thought. Yeah, very interesting.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I was a little surprised in your introduction that I think you were ad-libbing, I think, that you interchanged religion and spirituality.
My bad.
And I believe the distinction between those is a relevant one. You're particularly interested in language.
Yeah.
Some thoughts about that?
Well, and I think part of that may go to the fact that we still have a lot of a lot of room to grow in educating people on the differences and how they intersect as well, don't we?
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting, and I caught that too. Yes. And it's interesting because, as some of you know, my husband is a linguist and also a pastor. And as a linguist, he knows that religion actually comes from the Latin root to rebind or return to bondage. So religion is the idea that there's this set of rules, and if we adhere to these rules, then we will reap these benefits. Whereas, at least in the Christian religion with the New Testament, or I shouldn't say religion, the Christian faith with the New Testament, the idea is that those rules have been abolished, that you actually get a free gift first and then you respond to it. So that's why he named his church Church Without Religion, which has led many people to think it's a church for atheists. But there's a very interesting distinction between that, between faith, spirituality, and religion. What would you guys say?
I'm bad. If I don't have it written down, I just go off the rails.
I don't know. This is a good topic, guys. Freudian slip. Kevin?
Well, religion and spirituality can kind of double down, though, also, because religion is often the acting out of spirituality, or the kind of a codification of spirituality. And when you believe something very deeply and intensely, and you also act it out routinely, that belief gets even more deeply embedded and can sometimes explain why it's very, very difficult to get people to change their minds or to be open to a different kind of an insight or a different sort of action, which would be a form of religion, even if the action is conservation or thinking of material things in ways more than just is there a profit to be made here, or those kinds of things. So they're distinct things, but also when they work in tandem, they can create these binding kinds of notions that are very, very difficult to dislodge.
Yeah.
Well, and it seems like I hear that sometimes, talking about the distinction, but I wonder if there really is. Not that there is. I wonder if there is anybody on the planet who would say they're not spiritual.
25% of scientists.
Not spiritual.
Yes,
Okay.
according to Elaine's research.
But they probably like to listen to Mozart or something. That anytime, if you're transcending this sort of, the Krebs cycle of life, right? Of just sort of metabolism, your consciousness is spiritual. Right? And it's all right. We got 12 dimensions, or however many dimensions there are, and we're only seeing 4 of them. So there's something we're taking a lot on faith. So I don't know that you could say that. I mean, if they say that, I'd be real curious to say how they justified not being spiritual. It's just that would be a robotic, an automaton. But religion is the whole structure, right? It's the whole. It's in a lot of ritual, and again, it's the ritual that we really rely on a lot of times. There's something very comforting about that. And sometimes when you get into religion where they want you to think too much, it's like just be quiet and pass the plate.
Right. That's great.
Yes, sir.
If I remember right, that there is a very high-profile leader of one of the Christian religions, the Roman Catholic Church, that is Pope Francis. That the last year, I believe it was, he came out with a statement saying that we must be concerned about climate change. And so I'm
That
wondering,
helps.
has that message had an impact? Has that impacted some of the religious conservatives, or politically conservative people, or other discussions about, what is in the purview of spiritual discourse or religious discourse? Has that had some impact, you think?
I can give you some stats, and then maybe you can give personal examples. There's a program at Yale on climate communication, and they do a lot of public opinion polling. And so they very carefully went out and measured before and after and a while after, and they did detect a Pope effect. So there was a positive effect of that encyclical being released, and it did move the dial. I forget what the percentage was over the whole US population, but it was somewhere between 4 to 8% movement up. What's fascinating, though, is that about the same time, the American Association of Religion was polling people, asking them, how serious they thought climate change was and how often did they hear it talked about in church. And they separated out their results not by geographic location, like Yale does. They separated out by denomination. In previous studies, the Pew Foundation had just said, Catholics, mainline Protestants, evangelical Protestants, and African American Protestants. That was the Pew's group. But the AAR separated out into Hispanic Catholics versus white Catholics for the first time. Up until then, they'd found that Catholics were kind of middle of the road. When they separated them into Hispanic versus white Catholics, the result was absolutely stunning. Hispanic Catholics were the most concerned people group about climate change of any group in the United States. And white Catholics were the least, less than white evangelicals. And they're the same Pope.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think that shows that there's a transcendent, with a hierarchy of allegiances, and in this country our allegiances are primarily left or right. It's a tribal.
Political,
right?
yes.
Right, political and tribal, and it seems like Catholics, at least what my exposure out here, it's still a one-issue politics, right? The abortion thing, and so if climate science people are in favor of doing something about climate change, are liberal, and liberals are pro-choice, then they're out, right? Isn't that kind of a... Is that,
Or worse, population control.
yeah, right. I mean, I don't know that that's too... So I think that's so it would seem to have an effect probably, but I don't know because it violates that cardinal rule
It
against...
sets up a cognitive dissonance.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this Pope has more Protestant fans
Right.
than any Pope has. That's true. And that's kind of fascinating because that's creating opportunities for us to talk to each other, which is a good thing. I also know that he's highly polarizing because if you are already entrenched in a very conservative ideal, you resent very much that someone of his stature would come out and say these blasphemous things like science may know what they're talking about on this one, So he's a troubling figure to a lot of people too.
But if he's the symbol of the Catholic Church, and and Catholics are supposed to follow his example, then how do they rationalize denying that part of it?
You're hearing some conversation about, is this really the way we want to follow a Pope? Does the Pope have all
suddenly
the...
now,
Yeah.
suddenly now
It's
we've
a
got
ma-
to change.
Well, you're going to get the same thing as you got in politics.
Yeah.
Not my president.
Yeah.
my Pope, yeah.
When Clinton was in office, you'd see the gun people with their bumper stickers. Charlton Heston is my president. He was the head of the National Rifle Association, and so I think you'll start to see that splintering off.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Joe was gonna.
This is kind of a mashup a little bit. It seems to me that there's a distinction between Eastern and Western thought, spiritually speaking. And in the Bible, you're going to see dominion over the planet versus, or in conjunction with stewardship talked about in some points in time. So I think it's interesting if you study Taoism or Buddhism, there's this incredible connection to the planet. Whereas sometimes, in my thinking, Christian thought could be more its dominion over. So I wondered if y'all would want to take that.
It is a very East-West kind of a thing, and it's one of the solutions in the Western Church that we learn how to speak that language more. Earth in Western thought has been seen more often as a temporary holding place until we go on to the better place. And so that feeds into a kind of a loss of concern, and I'm even I got Larry Rasmussen is the person that I heard say this, and it makes sense to me. He and other eco-theologists and environmental ethicists are I'm hearing starting to steer even away from notions of stewardship because even stewardship still has embedded in it the notion of us taking care of that. And I'm hearing more conversation in Christian circles about being able to recognize the connection between the whole. And even quoting Scripture, and I think this is one of the things that we have to learn to do better, is because a lot of this is actually already there in our sacred texts. It's just that our texts have been interpreted. I think there's a mashup of capitalism and American Christianity.
Yeah.
And certainly our texts have been interpreted by the winners mostly. And so when I was listening to your song and how the notion of oil being a sacrament, and I remember a quote I came across, or a story I read about two board members of Exxon who had gone to board meetings over and over again and had continuously presented this petition for Exxon to start to be moved more in the direction of renewable energies, and our current Secretary of State making and this is an illustration of believing how good oil has been for us. And his statement was, what good is it to save the planet if humanity has to suffer?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty stunning.
And in that same article, there was a story, and I don't remember his name, but a coal CEO who says, what's the point in saving a mountain just to have a mountain?
Yes, right. As opposed to
And
cutting
see,
it
that's
down.
the complete opposite of the Eastern mindset.
Right.
And just to add a little tidbit to there about oil specifically, burning oil in the United States, we usually burn it in our cars. That's the most frequent use of oil. It is directly responsible for 200,000 premature human deaths every year in the United States. So I mean, talking about helping humanity, those 200,000 people don't count somehow. I mean, that's really stunning.
Well, the connection there's a leap of faith to say that that's what caused it, and anybody who's going to deny will deny that. You're talking about like breathing problems.
Yeah, I'm talking about scientific data that connects premature deaths to right, alternative facts.
Right,
Yes,
yeah.
got it.
Yeah.
I wanted to continue on that line. I was going to ask this previously. How can you convince society that alternative energy is the answer when the powerful vehicles are run by oil and coal? The power of a F-150 is not matched in any form or fashion for something that runs on battery.
Oil is an incredibly efficient. I mean, it's stored sunlight that's been sequestered, accrued and sequestered for millions and millions of years. And there's this saying that you hear, what fills a teacup and can lift 1,000 pounds a mile, and it's gasoline, right? You put it in your car and you drive up the side of it. That's incredible compression of energy. And yeah, the other sources aren't going to match that in the same way because they're taking sunlight that's coming in, and now it's like somebody was, the bank account. You're depositing all this for millions of years in the past, the Jurassic and the different periods, and withdrawing it out at a rapid rate. So it is hard to replace that. I don't know, Catherine. What do you think? I mean,
Well, it does depend because in terms of power and acceleration, the Tesla, which is 100% electric, has faster acceleration than anything short of a Formula One car. So things are changing, and creating a battery-powered pickup truck, I'm sure, is on Elon Musk's radar as well as many other people. And that's why solutions such as putting a price on carbon and refunding that money to people in their taxes, that's why those types of solutions make sense, because they say to people, you can still pick whatever you want, but you have to recognize there's a societal cost to your choice. You're going to pay that price if you want to continue that behavior. And so if you don't, there's a financial reward for it, but if you still want that and need that, you can have it. But you can have it with full responsibility for your impacts. We would love to change the world at the snap of our fingers, but the reality is progress is slow, as long as it's in the right direction. Yeah.
From a perspective of faith, you're talking about how do you convince society. I think one of the things I'm hearing and talked about more and more often is a recognition that there's a privileged class of people out there for whom all of this that we're talking about feels like loss.
Right.
And people of faith are going to have to, and I think scientists also are going to have to address that loss somehow. Our history has been we're not going to do anything to make that privileged class ever feel loss. I think now we're going to have to say, yes, you're going to feel lost, and here's how we can help you through that, which is a different
Well,
answer.
but then again, things like the trying to salvage the coal industry and what it's employs so few people anyway. Economically speaking, it'd be better to just pay all those people
Yeah.
and let them
Retrain them.
retrain them, or even if they just sat at home, which is not good for the spirit. But there's this symbolism. You know, again, we take the earth and for a lot of those guys, it's like the idea of driving a Prius. It seems kind of like a sissy thing to do.
Right.
Right?
I saw a stat.
You look
Yesterday-
Steve for that.
What's that?
Why'd you look
Why
at
you
me on
looking-
that?
why you looking at George?
I
And
saw
so-
just
yeah.
the difference between perception and reality. I saw a statistic yesterday, the day before, that comparing the jobs that Arby's produces
Right.
compared to all of the jobs in the coal industry, and Arby's far exceeds employment.
Right, but I ain't gonna work in no Arby's when you know.
But the president didn't promise to save the curly for us. Anybody else got a question? We got time for about one more. Yes.
Yeah, so I think kind of a subconscious thing that we've been discussing so far is gender. You know,
It is,
from
it's
rugged
true.
masculinity of oil workers to I'm not going to drive a Prius because that's sissy. So how does gender continue to intersect these questions of religion and climate change and create sort of this resistance to?
Massive.
Well, I'm going to drop another bump. Not only gender, but race.
Yes, yes.
Because there's a kind of a white fragility out there that is fearful of losing its status, and there's also been a perception that white males are the stewards of the earth and are running things just fine in the way that they should be. So there's gender, yes, patriarchy, all of those things, but also I would throw race in there as well.
Yeah, it's all perception of potential loss of power.
Just some interesting stats. So I have a Facebook page that gets a lot of comments on it, and so I'm a scientist, so I track the comments. And out of 1,000 negative comments, I average a couple a day, so you can get 1,000 pretty quickly. Out of 1,000 negative comments, one of them was from someone who is black. One. 0 were from somebody who was Asian or Native American. And I think about 4 were from a woman who was white. So literally 995 were from a white man.
Wow.
And I thought that was just absolutely stunning. And there's actually even research papers published on this role of both gender and race. You're perfectly right, it's gender and race, because the solutions to climate change are collective. It's a tragedy of the commons. We have to have collective rather than individual solutions. And somehow collective solutions have a gender component
Communist, damn near
to
communist.
them. Yeah, right. Right. So it is absolutely
Which
fascinating.
now I don't know.
Right. But it's definitely like the way I view the issues around climate today is that they are a casualty of bigger societal and cultural issues
Yes.
that have their roots go back decades and centuries, even millennia possibly.
But the point you made about the spiritualism, I mean, there's changes, but like in New Zealand now, the river has personhood, right? Did you hear that? The Maori. But that also seems like Gaia. It seems like some fruitcake thing that they come up with in California, and
That ain't happening in Texas.
Yeah, that's just.
Not until pot's legalized.
That's another issue.
And once they realize how much money they're losing, that's when whoops, we'll figure out a way to lose.
Unfortunately, I hate to cut this short. We've got to get out of here for another class. Let's give our panelists another round of applause.